Hi guys, welcome to Naresh IT. My name is Satish. In the last session, already we discussed about the introduction of Spring Boot and the main features of Spring Boot. In this video, I am going to be discussing how to create the Spring Boot application. How to create the Spring Boot application. Okay, in the last session already we discussed Spring Boot application possible to create in three ways: by using command line interface tools and by using start.spring.io website and by using Spring Tool Suite ID. In this session, I am going to be creating the Spring Boot application by using Spring Tool Suite ID. Okay, here I am going to be using Spring Tool Suite 3.8.0 version. It is compatible with JDK 8 version. Okay, if you wanted to create the Spring Boot application by using Spring Tool Suite ID, then you can click on File menu, New, and select Spring Starter Project. So to create the Spring Boot application, here you can select Spring Starter Project. Okay, the Spring Starter Project dialog window is asking to enter some details like project name, Java version, and group ID, artifact ID, version of your project and other required configurations. So here observe, I am entering my project name like hello example, and here I am choosing Maven as an application builder tool. Maven as an application builder tool. It is also possible to create here the Spring Boot application by using Gradle, but here I am choosing Maven. Next, Spring Boot application possible to create by using Java and Groovy, but here I am choosing Java as a programming language to create this application. And the Spring Boot application possible to pack as a jar, as well as it is possible to pack as a WAR file. Even though you are creating a web application, it is possible to pack our project as a jar file. That jar file is executing by embedded servers, that is providing by Spring Boot. Suppose if you don't want to execute your Spring Boot application on embedded server, then you can create your project as a WAR file and take that WAR file and also deploy into the required server. So you can also pack your project as a WAR file, take that WAR file and deploy in the required server. But here just I am going to be creating simple hello example, and it is not a web application, and here I am going to be packing my project as just a jar file only. Okay, next here I am choosing what? Maven as an application builder tool. So because of that reason, it is asking to enter group ID, artifact ID and version. So your group ID, just I am entering com.nareshit, artifact ID hello example, version of my project is 1.0, hello project for Spring Boot, and base package name also I am using as what? com.nareshit. And after entering all these basic details, then click on next button. Here it is asking to select Spring Boot version. Current version of Spring Boot, there is a stable version of Spring Boot is 1.4.3. So that's why here I am selecting Spring Boot 1.4.3. Okay, next it is asking to select some of the dependencies. Okay, for example, if you wanted to connect with the database, like if you wanted to connect with the MySQL database, then here you can select SQL, and in this you can select MySQL as a dependency. Then in this case what happens is, whatever the jar files required to connect with the MySQL database, that jar files by default providing by now Spring Boot with the help of Maven. Next, for example, if you wanted to develop your application by using JDBC, then here you can select JDBC. Then Spring Boot automatically providing one embedded data source object to connect from your Spring application to database. So similarly, whatever the dependency we are selected, based on the dependency, the required configurations are automatically providing by Spring Boot. Suppose if you wanted to create a web application, that is Spring MVC application, then here you can select one dependency as Spring Web. Then for MVC application, whatever the configurations required, all those configurations by default providing by Spring Boot. For example, if you are developing a Spring MVC application, it is required to be configure dispatcher servlet as a front controller in web.xml file. Okay, but when we are using Spring Boot by default providing the dispatcher servlet configurations in the form of Java code, because Spring Boot is completely avoiding XML configurations. Spring Boot only working with what? Java configurations. So whatever the dispatcher servlet configuration is required for your Spring MVC project, that is by default providing by Spring Boot without XML. Okay, like based on the selected dependency, the required configurations are providing by Spring Boot. Okay, here I am not selecting any dependency, because in the next application I will show how to connect with the database and how to develop the web application. In this, just my focus is how to develop one small hello example only. Because of that reason, here I am not selecting any dependency, and click on next button. Here the Spring Boot now going to be connecting with start.spring.io, and it is going to be creating your project, and whatever the details you are entered in the Spring starter window, based on that details only it is going to be creating the project. And when you are creating the Spring Boot application, it will connect with the start.spring.io website. Because of that reason, compulsory use the internet. So here now I am going to be creating my first application. Here it is connecting with what? start.spring.io and creating our project. So our project is created with the name of what? Hello example. Okay, in this one package is also created by default with the name of com.narrati, and by default the Spring Boot will create one main method class based on the project name. Here our project name is hello example, so Spring Boot is created one main method class with the name of hello example application. And here already you are using Maven as a application build tool, that's why by default is provided pom.xml file. Once observe the pom.xml file, in this pom.xml file, here it is showing one parent dependency. What is that one? org.springframework.boot and Spring Boot starter parent, and it is representing the version 1.4.3 dot release. So whatever the other dependencies is going to be including, all the dependencies also following the same boot version here. All other dependencies also following the same boot version. So because of that reason, other dependencies are not representing with again version. Here other dependencies are, it is included org.springframework.boot, Spring Boot starter, okay, org.springframework.boot, Spring Boot starter test. These are also follows the same version of the boot. Means these are also getting the version from where? Parent dependency. Okay, next here we are selected already the Java as a programming language, and Java we are selected 1.8. That's why in the POM it is showing language as Java and version 1.8. In general, if you are creating a Spring application with the help of Maven tool, many number of dependencies are required to be included in the pom.xml file. But if you are creating the same Spring application by using Spring Boot and Maven, whatever the dependency configurations required in the pom.xml, almost all that required dependency configurations by default providing by Spring Boot only. Okay, now concentrate here. In this I am not included even any dependency in the pom.xml, and by default is provided one main method class with the name of hello example. And this hello example is denoted with one annotation. The annotation is what? Spring Boot application. This annotation denoted with many number of other annotations internally. What are that? Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configurations, and one more important annotation, component scan to detect all the stereotype annotations, target retention documented and inherited. In this, these two are very important annotations. One is enable auto configuration and one more is component scan to detect all the stereotype annotations. So these are by default coming along with which annotation? Spring Boot application annotation. Okay, again I will discuss about this main method. Here first I am going to be writing one simple service class to display hello message. Okay, class, right click on your project, new class. Here my class name is hello service, package name com.nareshji.service. Okay, here the service class just we can denote with one stereotype annotation. The stereotype annotation is what? @ service. One more important point, when we are developing a Spring application by using Spring Boot, there is no XML configuration anywhere. Everything we are configuring with annotations only. And what is @ service annotation must be identified while learning Spring Framework only. Okay, here I am going to be using Spring Framework given annotations to develop the Spring Framework application with the help of Boot. Okay, so concentrate, what is the annotation I am using from Spring Framework? @ service. It is one of the stereotype annotation. Okay, @ service annotation is one of the stereotype annotation. If you are denoting any class with stereotype annotation, by default the bean name is maintaining as what? Class name. In Spring, now it is acting as a Spring Bean. The Spring Bean is a Spring Bean name. By default it is maintaining as what? Class name. Okay, by default it is maintaining the bean name as what? Hello service.